Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Colin Howell and a night that would haunt the coast of Northern Ireland for nearly 2 decades. Imagine the world falling into a deep, heavy slumber on the 18th of May, 1991. The air in the seaside village of Castlerock is thick with the scent of salt and the dampness of the Atlantic. It is a place of rugged beauty, where the waves crash against the basalt cliffs with a rhythmic, hypnotic thrum. On this particular night, the mist has rolled in from the sea, a soft, gray blanket that smothers the light of the moon and turns the street lamps into hazy, amber orbs. The village is silent, save for the distant, lonely call of a foghorn and the occasional rustle of the wind through the dune grass. Everything feels suspended in time, wrapped in a quiet so profound it feels as though the world is holding its breath. We are moving toward a row of cottages known as the Apostles, a name that suggests a sanctuary, a place of peace and holy stillness. But as the clock ticks past midnight and moves into the early hours of the 19th, a different kind of stillness is settling over one particular garage. It is a chill, heavy morning, the kind where the dew clings to every surface like a silver veil, and the cold seeps through the cracks of even the most well-built homes. Breathe in that cool, damp air and feel the weight of the mist against your skin as we step into the shadows of the 19th of May. The garage stands separate from the warmth of the living rooms, a structure of cold stone and corrugated metal that belonged to a man who had only recently passed away. The smell of the space is a mixture of old oil, weathered timber, and the lingering, earthy scent of garden tools that have not been moved in weeks. There is a specific quality to the silence here. It is not the peaceful silence of sleep, but the heavy, stagnant silence of a secret. Inside, a car is parked. It is a white Renault Savannah, an estate car that speaks of family trips and grocery runs, a vehicle designed for the mundane duties of a quiet life. But tonight, it is an island in the dark. The metal of the car is cool to the touch, and a fine layer of condensation has formed over its sleek white paint, making it shimmer faintly in the gloom. The garage door is shut tight, sealing the space off from the salt spray of the ocean. Within this enclosure, the air is changing. It is becoming heavy and sweet with the invisible weight of carbon monoxide. Imagine the sound of a distant engine hum, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard in the ears, slowly fading into nothingness as the fuel runs dry. The garage is a tomb of mist and metal, waiting for the sun to rise and reveal the tableau that has been so carefully arranged within its walls. As the first light of dawn begins to bleed into the sky, a pale, watery blue, the details of the car's interior become visible through the glass. The windows are clouded with a thick, milky fog of moisture from within. If you were to reach out and wipe a small circle into that condensation, your fingers would feel the biting cold of the glass before revealing the scene inside. In the front seat, a man is slumped. This is Trevor Buchanan. He is 32 years old, a father and a police officer, a man whose life was built on the foundation of order and duty. He wears a blue striped shirt, the fabric slightly rumpled, his head tilted back against the headrest as if he has simply drifted off while waiting for someone to return. His hands are still, his expression fixed in a mask of terminal peace. There is a haunting stillness to his posture. His legs are positioned naturally, yet there is a subtle wrongness to the scene, a detail that the casual observer might miss in the early morning light. The air inside the cabin is still, the oxygen long since replaced by the silent, scentless gas that stole his breath while he dreamed. The silence around him is absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine, a sound that grows slower and slower until it ceases entirely, leaving only the sound of the sea in the distance. Moving our gaze to the back of the estate car, we find Leslie Howell. She is 31 years old, a nurse and a mother of 4 young children. She is lying in the rear, her body arranged with a terrifying, meticulous care. She is wearing a dark tracksuit, her head resting on a pillow as if she were in her own bed at home. But it is the small details that make the heart ache and the mind wander into the depths of the tragedy. Pressed against her ears are a pair of foam-padded Walkman headphones. The thin, black wire snakes down to a small cassette player resting beside her. If you could listen, you would hear the faint, tinny whisper of Christian gospel music, a song of faith and redemption playing into ears that can no longer hear. Beside her, arranged like icons on a shrine, are 5 photographs of her children. Their smiling faces, captured in moments of joy and innocence, stare back at the empty air of the garage. One photo shows a toddler with a messy grin. Another shows a child in a school uniform. These images were placed there to tell a story of a mother so overwhelmed by grief and betrayal that she chose to take these memories with her into the dark. The arrangement is so perfect, so heartbreakingly deliberate, that it feels less like a scene of a tragedy and more like a carefully constructed stage, designed to evoke a specific, devastating response from whoever finds it. Connected to the exhaust of the Renault is a length of vacuum cleaner hose. It is a mundane household object, a flexible plastic tube that should be used for cleaning carpets and tidying rooms. Now it has been repurposed into a tether between the machine and the victims. The hose runs from the back of the car, snaking through the air and disappearing into the vehicle's interior through a small gap. The sight of it is jarring, a piece of domestic utility turned into an instrument of silence. The smell of the garage is now dominated by the acrid, metallic tang of exhaust fumes, a scent that clings to the curtains of the car and the fabric of the seats. The mist outside has begun to lift, and the village is waking up. The sound of a milk float in the distance, the clink of glass bottles, the first chirping of birds in the hedgerows. All of these signs of life contrast sharply with the frozen world inside the garage at number 12 The Apostles. It is 5:30 in the morning on that Sunday, and the world believes that 2 broken souls have found a way to end their pain together. The community of Castlerock, a place of deep faith and close-knit ties, is about to be shattered by a discovery that seems, on the surface, to be a simple, tragic choice made by 2 people caught in a web of infidelity and despair. When the police finally arrive, they find the scene exactly as it was intended to be found. They see the headphones, the photos, the hose, and the 2 bodies that seem to have found a final, desperate peace. They see a husband and a wife from different families who had been brought together by a shared burden of betrayal. To the investigators standing in the chill of that May morning, it looks like a suicide pact, a double tragedy born of religious guilt and a broken heart. They do not see the invisible fingerprints of the man who walked along the beach in the dark, the man who staged every photo and adjusted every limb. They do not hear the silence of the bicycle wheels on the path as Colin Howell made his escape back to a life he had just violently cleared of obstacles. For now, the secret is safe, tucked away in the shadows of the garage and the mist. The village mourns, the families weep, and the truth lies buried under layers of gospel music and carefully placed family portraits. As you listen to the sound of the waves in your mind, let the weight of this night settle over you. The air is still, the mist is thick, and the secrets of 1991 are only just beginning to take root in the cold, damp earth of Castlerock. Close your eyes and feel the rhythm of the sea, the heartbeat of the coast, as we prepare to follow the long, winding path that leads from this garage to a confession 20 years in the making. The air inside the Coleraine Baptist Church always held a specific weight, a mixture of lemon-scented floor wax, the faint, metallic tang of the heating pipes, and the ancient, dry smell of paper from hundreds of well-worn hymnals. In the early morning light, dust motes danced in the pale columns of sun that filtered through the high windows, settling quietly upon the polished mahogany of the pews. It was here, amidst the hushed reverence of the sanctuary, that Colin Howell was most visible. He was a man of impeccable order, a dental surgeon whose hands were accustomed to the micro-movements of fine instruments. In the community, he was more than a doctor. He was a lay preacher, a pillar of faith whose voice was as steady and clean as the sterile environment of his surgery. People looked at Colin and saw the embodiment of success and spirit, a father of 4 children with a home that hummed with the quiet rhythm of Christian devotion. His wife, Leslie, was a nurse, a woman who understood the language of care and the exhaustion of long shifts, yet she remained the quiet anchor of their domestic life. They were the portrait of stability in a Northern Ireland that often felt fractured and gray. But beneath the starch of his Sunday shirts and the precision of his professional life, there was a restlessness that the pews could not contain. The year was 1989 when the first ripple appeared in the still water of his life. It didn't happen in the church, but at the Ballymoney Leisure Centre, where the air was thick with the heavy, humid scent of chlorine and the echoing shouts of children splashing in the pool. It was during these swimming lessons that Colin first encountered Hazel Stewart. She was a Sunday school teacher, a woman with a soft, porcelain-like beauty and a gentle demeanor that seemed to radiate a quiet vulnerability. Hazel was married to Trevor Buchanan, an officer with the Royal Ulster Constabulary, a man whose life was defined by the rigid demands of duty and the constant, underlying tension of policing during the Troubles. Trevor was a good man, steady and humble, but perhaps he lacked the charismatic intensity that Colin Howell wore like a second skin. At the edge of the pool, as the humid air dampened their clothes and the blue water shimmered before them, a connection was forged that would eventually erode every boundary of their shared faith. By the summer of 1990, the connection had deepened into something far more dangerous. Their affair began in the stolen moments between responsibilities, in the quiet shadows of the Castlerock forest, where the wind hissed through the thick canopy of pine needles and the damp earth smelled of moss and decay. They would meet in the silver-gray light of late afternoon, the world outside their car windows disappearing into a blur of green and shadow. For Colin, the relationship was not merely a betrayal. It was an addiction, a powerful, intoxicating pull that he began to justify through a warped lens of spiritual entitlement. He spoke to Hazel in the language of the church, convincing her that their connection was not a sin, but a gift, a divine plan that transcended the mundane rules of their marriages. Hazel, caught in the magnetic wake of his confidence, found herself drifting further from the shore of her own life. She was the one who taught the children of the parish about the 10 Commandments, yet in the quiet, shaded groves of the forest, those ancient laws felt distant and ethereal, muffled by the sound of her own heartbeat and the persuasive, rhythmic whisper of Colin's voice. The sanctuary was eventually breached when a member of the congregation spotted them together in the woods, a single moment of exposure that shattered their carefully maintained facade. The scandal rippled through the Baptist community like a stone dropped into a mirror. They were brought before the church elders and the pastor, John Hansford, in a room that felt suddenly cold and judgmental. The smell of the wood wax now seemed suffocating, the weight of the silence unbearable. Both Colin and Hazel confessed, their voices small and contrite in the face of such public shame. They were urged to seek counseling, to return to their spouses and mend the fractures they had caused. For a time, it seemed as though the order of things had been restored. Colin returned to Leslie, and Hazel returned to Trevor. There were tears, prayers for forgiveness, and the outward appearance of a difficult but successful reconciliation. Trevor, ever the stoic, wanted his marriage to survive, and Leslie, though devastated, clung to the hope that the man she had married was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of deception. However, as the calendar turned toward the early months of 1991, the repentance began to sour. The counseling sessions grew shorter, and the silence in their respective homes became a heavy, physical presence. Colin Howell's dental practice in Ballymoney continued to thrive, but his mind was no longer on the precision of his drills or the porcelain of his crowns. He felt a growing, dark resentment toward the life he had been forced to reclaim. In his mind, he was a man destined for a greater passion, a more profound union than the one he shared with a wife who was increasingly fragile and reliant on prescription medication to cope with the pain of his betrayal. By the time the spring rains began to fall on the North Coast in 1991, the affair had been rekindled in secret. They were no longer just two people caught in a web of lust. They were two people who felt trapped by the very community they had once led. The sanctuary of the church had become a prison of expectation, and the sin they had once confessed was now the only thing that made them feel alive. The plan began not with a shout, but with a series of quiet, clinical thoughts. As Colin Howell looked at the hoses in his garage and the sedative vials in his surgery, realizing that to truly be together, the past would have to be erased entirely. And the air in the house grew heavy with a purpose that had nothing to do with healing. Inside the shadows of his garage, Colin began to look at his Renault Savannah not as a family vehicle, but as an instrument of finality. The garage was a place of cold concrete and the lingering scent of damp earth, typical of a northern Irish spring. In the quiet hours of 1991, he would stand there, his hands resting on the cool, metallic surface of the car, imagining the silent flow of carbon monoxide. He was a man of precision, a dentist accustomed to the steady application of tools and the careful management of anesthesia. To him, the transition from saving lives to ending them was merely a matter of shifting the objective. He began to gather the components for what he coldly referred to as the procedure. There was no frenzy in his movements, only a slow, rhythmic preparation that mirrored the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway. He found a length of garden hose, its surface slightly weathered and rough to the touch, and laid it out across the oil-stained floor like a sleeping serpent. The green plastic felt stiff in the chill of the evening, and as he ran his fingers along its length, he was already calculating the distance between the garage and the sanctuary of the living room. Perhaps the most chilling detail of his design was the piece that would bridge the gap between the car and the hose. Colin took a baby's feeding bottle, a domestic object usually associated with the soft breath of a sleeping infant, and held it up to the dim light of the garage. With the steady hand of a surgeon, he took a blade and sliced the plastic bottle in half. The sound of the plastic yielding was a sharp, final rasp that echoed against the brick walls. This improvised coupling would be the seal, the conduit that allowed the toxic exhaust to flow from the Renault's pipe into the lungs of his unsuspecting wife. He tested the fit, sliding the severed bottle over the exhaust, and then securing the garden hose to the other end. It was a macabre invention, born of a mind that saw no contradiction between his role as a father and his role as an architect of death. He moved with a quiet, terrifying grace, ensuring every connection was tight, every seam reinforced. He could hear the muffled sounds of his children upstairs, the soft creak of floorboards that spoke of a normal, peaceful life. Yet he remained focused on the mechanical requirements of his plan. The air in the garage felt thinner now, as if the oxygen were already being replaced by the weight of his intentions. Once the apparatus was constructed, Colin began the process of measuring the world around him with lethal accuracy. He stepped out of the garage and into the main house, counting his strides with a rhythmic intensity. 1, 2, 3. His shoes made a soft, muffled thud on the carpet. He reached the kitchen, then the utility room, and finally the living room where Leslie often slept on the sofa, seeking a brief respite from her own growing despair. He calculated the distance to be exactly 25 paces. 25 paces of hose would be required to bring the poison from the garage to the place where she rested. He visualized the path the hose would take, snaking through the doorways, hugging the baseboards, a hidden intruder in the dark. He practiced the route in the silence of the night, moving through the house without turning on the lights, his eyes adjusted to the silver glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. He noted the way the shadows fell across the furniture, the way the smell of floor wax mingled with the faint, metallic tang of the tools he had left behind. Everything had to be seamless. There could be no stumbling, no misplaced movements when the time finally came. He was crafting a stage, and he was the only one who knew the script. But the design was not his alone to carry. In another house, not far away, Hazel was also moving through the motions of a life she intended to discard. They met in the quiet, desperate spaces between their public lives, whispering of a future that required 2 graves. Colin provided the technical expertise, but Hazel provided the access. He gave her a supply of sedatives, the same drugs he used in his dental practice to calm the nerves of the fearful. He instructed her on how to administer them, how to slip the pills into a meal so that Trevor, a fit and observant police officer, would be rendered helpless. Hazel followed his directions with a numb, rhythmic compliance. She prepared a tuna sandwich for her husband, the soft bread hiding the bitter chemical taste of the crushed tablets. As she watched him eat, the ticking of the kitchen clock must have sounded like a countdown. The planning was a shared secret, a dark bond that tightened with every whispered instruction. They were no longer just lovers, they were co-conspirators in a grand, lethal architecture. Colin reassured her, his voice a soothing, low murmur that promised a world without the burden of their spouses. He told her it was necessary, that it was a way to find peace, and in the haze of their obsession, the morality of the act was buried beneath the technical details of the execution. As the middle of May approached, the plan reached its final, polished state. Colin had rehearsed every step, from the moment he would start the car to the moment he would retrieve the hose. He had even planned the aftermath, the way he would drive the bodies to the coast at Castlerock to stage a scene of mutual despair. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had performed countless delicate procedures, and saw only a means to an end. The weather in Coleraine was turning damp and gray, a mist rolling in from the sea that blurred the edges of the world. It was a perfect shroud. He sat in his study, the light of a single lamp casting long, distorted shadows against the walls, and went over the timeline one last time. 1991 was supposed to be a year of renewal for the church and for his family, but for Colin, it was the year of the Great Clearing. He felt a strange, cold peace, a sense of rightness that only a mind truly detached from empathy could maintain. The garden hose was coiled and ready, the baby bottle was fitted, and the sedatives were in place. The deadly design was complete, a masterpiece of domestic horror waiting for the cover of darkness to be unveiled. He closed his eyes and listened to the rain tapping against the glass, a soft, insistent sound that mirrored the steady, unwavering beat of his own heart. The moment he would pull the yellow hose into the silent living room. The night of May 18th, 1991, was thick with the scent of spring flowers and the lingering sweetness of a young child's birthday cake. The house was finally still, the soft, rhythmic breathing of 4 children upstairs creating a fragile mask of domestic peace. Downstairs, in the living room, Leslie lay on the settee, her eyes closed in a sleep deepened by the medication Colin had carefully administered. Outside, the world was a canvas of deep indigos and grays, and the silver Renault Savannah sat idling in the driveway like a predator in wait. Colin moved with the practiced precision of a surgeon. He had modified a yellow garden hose, attaching a section of a baby's feeding bottle to one end to create a makeshift seal. His fingers, usually so steady during dental procedures, did not tremble as he guided the hose through the gap he had prepared. The engine's low, mechanical thrum was a dull vibration in the quiet night, a sound that should have been comforting, but instead heralded a slow, invisible invasion of the home. He watched as the toxic, colorless gas began to fill the room, a silent breath of death that carried no warning. The air became heavy, a viscous quality settling over the furniture and the sleeping form of his wife. For a long moment, there was only the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant, lonely call of a bird in the trees. Then, the stillness was shattered. Leslie stirred, her body instinctively reacting to the oxygen being robbed from her lungs. She gasped, her eyes fluttering open to find the room blurred and the air thick with a metallic tang. In her final, desperate moments of consciousness, she called out the name of her eldest son, Matthew. It was a cry for protection, a mother's reflexive plea, but it was met only by the cold, firm grip of her husband. Colin held her down, his weight anchoring her to the settee until her struggles softened and finally ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy shroud that seemed to press against the very walls of the house. Once the life had fully retreated from Leslie's frame, Colin did not pause to mourn. He moved with a chilling, clinical detachment, lifting his wife's limp body and carrying her to the boot of the car. The metal of the Renault felt icy against his palms as he carefully arranged her inside, draping a sheet over her like a discarded piece of furniture. To further the illusion he intended to create, he hoisted a bicycle into the back, the metal frame clattering softly against the interior. He checked the upstairs rooms one last time, ensuring the children were still lost in the innocence of sleep, before stepping out into the cool night air. He picked up the telephone and dialed a number he knew by heart. When Hazel answered, his voice was as steady as a winter stream. "It is done," he whispered, the 3 words carrying the weight of a dark covenant. He steered the car away from the house, the headlights cutting 2 narrow paths through the deepening fog as he made his way toward the Buchanan's residence. The streets were deserted, the street lamps casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the pavement like ghosts. Every turn of the wheel brought him closer to the second half of his grim architecture. At the Buchanan home, the atmosphere was different, thick with a shared, unspoken anticipation. Hazel was waiting, the door to the garage already open to welcome him. Inside, Trevor lay in his own bed, his senses dulled by the tranquilizers Hazel had slipped into his drink. The betrayal was complete before Colin even stepped over the threshold, a collaborative effort of poison and silence. In the dim light of the Buchanan bedroom, the process began again, though it lacked the quiet submission of the first act. Colin brought the yellow hose inside, the scent of exhaust fumes now clinging to his clothes like a physical stain. As the carbon monoxide began to permeate the air, Trevor, a police officer trained to sense danger, fought back even through the haze of the drugs. A desperate, muffled struggle ensued in the shadows of the room. The 2 men grappled, the sound of their labored breathing the only thing filling the space. Colin felt the surge of adrenaline, the primal heat of the conflict contrasting with the icy resolve of his mind. He was aware of the risk, the possibility of being overcome by the very fumes he was using as a weapon, yet he did not waver. He pressed the hose closer, the toxic air a silent executioner. Eventually, the strength left Trevor's limbs, and the room returned to its eerie, suffocating calm. Hazel stood nearby, a silent witness to the erasure of her husband, her presence a necessary pillar in the bridge Colin was building toward their new life. Together, they moved Trevor's body, the weight of a grown man requiring a more labored effort. They placed him in the Renault alongside Leslie, 2 lives now reduced to cargo. The car was a vessel of secrets, idling in the dark, its engine a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath their feet. The plan was half-finished, the most delicate part of the deception yet to be performed in the shadows of the Atlantic coast. With both victims secured, Colin began the drive toward the coastal village of Castlerock. The road was a winding ribbon of blackness, flanked by the rugged beauty of the Northern Ireland landscape. To his left, the Atlantic Ocean churned, the sound of the waves a rhythmic, hollow boom against the cliffs. The air outside was turning sharper, carrying the salt and spray of the sea, a stark contrast to the stagnant, poisonous atmosphere inside the vehicle. He drove with careful precision, adhering strictly to the speed limit, his eyes scanning for any sign of a late-night patrol. He passed a police checkpoint, the irony of a murderer being waved through by the very colleagues of the man lying dead in his boot, not lost on him. He felt a sense of divine providence, a twisted belief that his success was a sign of favor. The Renault moved like a ghost through the night, the silver paint reflecting the pale glow of the moon. He reached the cluster of cottages known as the 12 Apostles, a row of Victorian holiday homes that stood like silent sentinels overlooking the water. One of these belonged to his late father-in-law, a place of family memories that he was about to transform into a site of engineered tragedy. He backed the car into the narrow, damp garage, the stone walls amplifying the hum of the engine. The space was cramped, smelling of sea salt, old wood, and the increasingly sharp tang of carbon monoxide. Here, in the belly of this small stone structure, he would begin the meticulous task of staging the final scene. The staging was an exercise in macabre artistry, a desperate attempt to write a story that would satisfy the eyes of the law and the hearts of the church. Colin moved the bodies with the care of a window dresser, his mind focused on the narrative of a double suicide. He placed Trevor in the front seat, slumping him over to suggest a man who had simply given up. Leslie was positioned in the back, her body arranged in a way that spoke of a tragic, final surrender. He placed a Walkman over her ears, the headphones resting against her temples, and set a tape of gospel music to play. The soft, tinny sound of hymns drifted through the car, a haunting soundtrack to the darkness. In her hands, he placed photographs of their children, a calculated touch designed to tug at the heartstrings of anyone who found them. He wanted the scene to bleed with the pathos of a broken woman and a shamed man seeking a final, desperate escape together. He then ran the hose from the exhaust into the car's interior, making sure the seal was just loose enough to look like a clumsy, amateur attempt. He rolled down the driver's side window slightly, a detail that would later be noted for its inconsistency. But in the heat of the moment, it was simply part of the frantic puzzle. He turned the ignition on, the garage filling with a thick gray cloud that obscured the forms inside. The engine's steady heartbeat was the only sound in the small space, a mechanical rhythm that would continue until the fuel ran dry or the air became too thick to sustain the spark. He stepped out of the garage, closing the door behind him, leaving the two victims to their eternal, silent pact. The final stage of the night required a physical exodus. Colin did not return to his car. Instead, he stepped out into the biting cold of the Castlerock beach. The sand was dark and damp under his feet, the tide retreating and leaving behind a mirror-like sheen that reflected the stars. He began to run, his breath coming in sharp, white plumes as he navigated the shoreline. The physical exertion was a release, a way to burn off the lingering tremors of the night's violence. He reached a secluded spot where he had hidden a change of clothes and a bicycle earlier. With the same methodical focus, he stripped off the garments that carried the scent of death and the traces of his struggle. He gathered them into a small pile and struck a match. The flame bloomed in the darkness, a small, orange flower that quickly grew into a hungry fire. He watched as the fabric turned to ash, the evidence of his presence at the crime scene dissolving into the salt air. Once the fire had burned low, he buried the remains in the sand, letting the sea eventually reclaim the site. He then mounted the bicycle he had pulled from the boot of the car earlier in the night. The ride back to Coleraine was long and uphill, his legs burning as he pedaled through the pre-dawn light. The sky was beginning to pale, the deep indigos giving way to a soft, bruised purple. He arrived home just as the first birds began their morning chorus, sneaking back into the house and checking on the children one last time. They were still asleep, blissfully unaware that their world had been irrevocably shattered. At 7 o'clock, he would pick up the phone to report his wife missing, beginning the 20-year lie that would define the rest of his life. The dawn that followed the discovery at the garage in Castlerock arrived with a pale, indifferent light, casting long shadows over the seaside town. When the police arrived, the air was still thick with the cloying, heavy scent of carbon monoxide and the salt spray from the nearby Atlantic. The blue lights of the patrol cars pulsed rhythmically against the damp stone walls, a silent heartbeat in the morning mist. Two senior detectives stood before the open garage door, their breath blooming in the chill air. Inside the car, the scene had been meticulously curated. Leslie, with her headphones still resting against her hair, and Trevor, slumped in a posture that Colin had carefully engineered to suggest a final, desperate embrace. The investigators looked, but they did not truly see. They saw the family photographs tucked into the sun visor. They heard the faint, ghostly hiss of a cassette tape that had reached its end. They breathed in the narrative of a suicide pact, a story so tragic and neatly packaged that it felt, to their weary minds, like the only possible truth. They did not notice the small, jagged abrasions on Trevor's mouth and nose, the silent evidence of a struggle for breath. They overlooked the dark, rust-colored stain on his sweatshirt, a trace of blood that whispered of violence rather than surrender. In those first critical hours, the golden hour of forensic discovery, the opportunities to find the truth slipped away like sand through open fingers. No fingerprints were lifted from the door frames. No precise measurements were taken of the hose that snaked from the exhaust. The bias of the investigators was a heavy, invisible veil, blinding them to the inconsistencies that lay in plain sight. In the weeks that followed, the community of Coleraine wrapped Colin and Hazel in a shroud of profound, misplaced sympathy. The funerals were somber affairs, filled with the soft weeping of congregants and the scent of lilies that seemed to choke the air in the small church. Colin stood at the graveside, a figure of dignified, broken-hearted grief, his head bowed as the damp earth was shoveled onto the casket of the woman he had silenced. He played the part of the grieving widower with a terrifying precision, his voice steady as he thanked those who brought casseroles to his door and offered to watch his children. Hazel, too, retreated into a quiet, fragile shell, her eyes downcast, the perfect image of a woman devastated by the twin betrayals of an affair and a suicide. The world saw two victims, bound by a shared tragedy, and the church elders spoke in hushed tones about the inscrutable trials of the soul. Behind the closed doors of their respective homes, the illicit flame that had driven them to murder began to flicker and cool. The reality of what they had done sat between them like a cold, unbridgeable chasm. They met in secret, in the quiet corners of parks or the shadows of late-night drives, but the passion was now laced with a bitter, metallic taste of fear. By 1996, the affair that had claimed 2 lives simply ceased to be. They drifted apart, 2 ghosts haunting the same town, each carrying a secret that was slowly turning into a leaden weight within their chests. Colin Howell did not allow his life to stagnate in the shadow of his crime. Instead, he built a monument to his own perceived righteousness. He moved his dental practice to the town of Ballymoney, where the click of his instruments and the sterile smell of antiseptic defined his days. He was the perfect professional, a man of standing and influence who greeted his patients with a reassuring smile and a gentle hand. He remarried a woman named Kyle, an American divorcee whose presence seemed to signal a fresh start, a clean slate. Together, they filled a large house with the sounds of children, 10 in total across his 2 lives, and the rhythms of a devout, busy household. To the outside world, Colin was a pillar of the Baptist community, a lay preacher whose voice rang out with conviction during Sunday service. He walked the streets with the confidence of a man who believed he had outrun God. But the cracks began to spiderweb through the porcelain veneer of his life. In 2007, a deep, personal darkness descended when his eldest son, Matthew, the same name Leslie had cried out in her final moments, died in a tragic accident in Russia. The young man fell down a stairwell, a sudden and violent end that shook Colin to his core. He began to see the hand of a vengeful providence in the shadows of his hallway. He felt the weight of his sins pressing down, a spiritual debt that no amount of professional success or church attendance could ever fully repay. The silence of the house at night became a deafening roar, a reminder that the past was never truly buried. While Colin's life was marked by a frantic, expansive ambition, Hazel's path was one of quiet, domestic assimilation. She continued her work as a teacher, her days filled with the bright, innocent voices of children who knew nothing of the darkness she harbored. She was a mother who was fiercely protected by her own children, Lisa and Andrew, who grew up believing their father had abandoned them through choice, never suspecting the hand that had truly taken him. In 2005, Hazel married again. Her new husband, David Stewart, was a man of high standing and unassailable character, a former police superintendent. There is a chilling irony in the thought of Hazel sitting across the dinner table from a man whose entire career had been dedicated to the pursuit of justice, while she held the secret of a double murder behind her teeth. She lived in a world of polished surfaces and manicured gardens, a life that seemed entirely disconnected from the cold garage in Castlerock. Yet, witnesses would later describe her as a woman who seemed frozen, as if she were perpetually waiting for a footfall that never came. She was a master of the long pretense, maintaining the facade of the shy, gentle Sunday school teacher, while the ghost of Trevor Buchanan lingered in the periphery of her vision. For nearly 18 years, she and Colin moved through the world as if they were invisible to the law, two ordinary people living ordinary lives, while the truth lay dormant, coiled like a serpent beneath the floorboards of their shared history. The final unraveling began not with a police knock at the door, but with the slow, grinding rot of Colin's finances and his own spiraling psyche. He became obsessed with a get-rich-quick scheme involving lost gold in the Philippines, a pursuit that saw him pour hundreds of thousands of pounds into a void. He sold his dental practices, scammed his own patients, and watched as £350,000 vanished into the hands of fraudsters. He was a man who had gambled with lives and won, but now he was losing everything else. The loss of his money, coupled with the lingering grief for his son, fractured his mind. He began to confess other sins, dark, predatory acts committed in his dental surgery, where he had drugged and assaulted his patients while they lay helpless in his chair. The darkness he had kept caged for nearly 2 decades was bursting through the seams of his life. By January of 2009, the pressure had become an unbearable physical force. He stood in the center of his world and watched it crumble, the echoes of the 1991 murders finally catching up to the man who thought he had outsmarted fate. He realized that the only way to find peace, or perhaps the only way to exert one final act of control, was to speak the words he had held back for 18 years. The pretense was over, and the long, cold winter of his reckoning was about to begin. The month of January in the year 2009 arrived with a biting, persistent frost that seemed to cling to the very stones of the town of Coleraine. Inside the quiet, shadowed sanctuary of the Baptist church, the air was perfectly still, heavy with the faint, lingering scent of floor wax and the dry dust of old hymnals. Colin Howell sat in the silence, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white as polished bone. For 18 long years, he had carried a secret that functioned like a phantom weight, a heavy, invisible cross that had grown more leaden with every passing season. He was a man of high standing, a respected dentist, and a pillar of the faith, but beneath the pressed shirts and the professional smile, the rot of 1991 had finally hollowed him out. The silence of the church felt like an accusation, pressing against his eardrums until he could no longer bear the sound of his own steady breathing. He reached out to the church elders, his voice a low, jagged rasp as he began to speak the words that would shatter the carefully constructed peace of 2 decades. He told them everything: the garden hose, the fumes, the darkness of the garage, and the 2 lives he had snuffed out to satisfy a craving for a woman who was no longer his. As the words spilled out, the elders listened in a frozen, horrified silence, the air in the room turning brittle as the perfect facade of Colin Howell finally crumbled into gray ash. The catalyst for this sudden, desperate confession was not a simple pang of conscience, but a series of tragedies that Colin interpreted as divine retribution. In the year 2007, his eldest son, Matthew, had died in a tragic accident in St. Petersburg, Russia. The young man had fallen 40 feet from a balcony, his life ending in a sudden, violent instant half a world away. To Colin, the irony was a jagged blade. 18 years earlier, his wife Leslie had cried out for her son Matthew with her very last breath as Colin held the gas pipe to her face. He became convinced that the universe was balancing the scales, that the death of his son was the price demanded for the murder of his wife. This psychological torment was compounded by the complete collapse of his earthly kingdom. He had been lured into a complex financial scam by a woman in the Philippines, losing hundreds of thousands of pounds until his bank accounts were hollowed out, and his professional reputation was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. He felt the walls of his life closing in, a suffocating pressure that mimicked the very fumes he had used in 1991. He believed that if he did not confess, the shadows would continue to claim everything he loved. Driven by a mixture of religious terror and a broken ego, he walked into the police station in Coleraine, the cold brass of the door handle feeling like ice against his palm, and surrendered to the ghosts of the past. While Colin sought a twisted kind of redemption through his confession, the news hit Hazel Stewart like a physical blow. By 2009, Hazel had successfully woven herself into a completely new tapestry of respectability. She was married to a retired police officer, David Stewart, and lived in a beautiful, sun-drenched home where the horrors of the past seemed like a faded, bad dream. When the police arrived at her door, the morning light was likely soft and golden, a cruel contrast to the grim reality that was about to overtake her. She had spent nearly 20 years convincing herself that she was a victim, a passenger in Colin's dark designs, rather than a co-pilot. As the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, the sound was a sharp, metallic echo of the night she had stood in her kitchen, listening to her husband Trevor's struggle for air in the room nearby. The community was paralyzed with shock. The image of the kindly nursery assistant and the devout Sunday school teacher was replaced by the image of a woman who had helped dispose of evidence and watched her husband die. The perfect, quiet life she had built on the foundation of 2 graves was beginning to tilt and slide into the sea, leaving her exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the legal system. The trial of Hazel Stewart in the year 2011 was a somber, theatrical affair that gripped the nation. The courtroom in Coleraine was packed with onlookers, the air thick with the smell of damp coats and the electric tension of a long-delayed reckoning. Hazel sat in the dock, often wearing a soft, pale blue top and a delicate cross necklace, her expression one of fragile innocence that many found difficult to reconcile with the testimony. Colin Howell, already sentenced to a minimum of 21 years, took the stand as the star witness against his former lover. His voice was cold and clinical as he described their blood pact, detailing how she had drugged Trevor's tuna sandwich and how they had worked in a synchronized, horrific rhythm to ensure the murders were successful. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who was not a helpless victim of a master manipulator, but a willing participant who chose a new life over the lives of the people she was supposed to love. They spoke of the hosepipe she had helped to hide and the sheets she had changed while her husband's body was still warm. For 15 days, the jury listened to the mechanical details of the perfect murder, watching as the polished veneer of both defendants was stripped away to reveal something deeply chilling underneath. In the end, the jury's verdict was unanimous. Hazel Stewart was found guilty of double murder, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison, with a minimum of 18 years to be served behind bars. Justice, though delayed by nearly 2 decades, finally arrived in the grey coastal air of Northern Ireland. But for the families of Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan, the resolution brought a complicated kind of peace. The children, now grown, had to reconcile the memory of their parents with the knowledge that their deaths had been a calculated execution, not a tragic choice of despair. The images of the fume-filled car at Castlerock remain etched in the local memory, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind the veil of religious devotion and professional success. Colin and Hazel remain in their separate cells, the echoes of their blood-pact now silenced by the thick stone walls of the prison. The case serves as a haunting testament to the fact that secrets have a way of breathing, of growing, and of eventually demanding to be heard. The weight of the cross that Colin Howell claimed to carry was never his alone. It was a burden he forced upon everyone who ever trusted him. As the years pass, the waves continue to crash against the cliffs at Castlerock, and the wind still whispers through the trees near the homes where the light was once extinguished. The story of the dentist and the Sunday school teacher is a story of how far humans will go to find a version of happiness that they do not deserve. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.